Welcome to the Age of Discovery. In this first lecture of our American History series, we'll be looking at the Age of Discovery and Spanish exploration all the way through the Spanish period. And as we do this, we'll be using Gary Nash's famous book, Red, White, and Black, and looking at America as a collision of cultures of red, the American Indian, white, the European, and black, the Africans. Before we get too deep into the American Indian culture, or the red culture as Gary Nash called it, we need to figure out where those first Americans came from. Now, most historians believe they crossed Beringia. Beringia was this landmass that connected Asia with the Americas. We'll call this the First Great Migration. They probably crossed this landmass following the herd or looking for better pasture lands. This happened somewhere between 10,000 and 40,000 years ago. As they crossed this landmass and pushed themselves further and further south, they settled both North and South America. Once the founding gene base reached North and South America, they abandoned their nomadic lifestyle and instead became farmers and pastoralists. We call this the Neolithic Revolution, or the shift from hunting and gathering to settled agriculture. While this happened all over the world at different times, it happened here in North and South America probably about the year 7000 BCE. The effect of this is going to be long-term, long-range. Cities are going to develop. Specialization is going to develop. The fact that we no longer needed to follow the herd means that we could develop wonderful architecture as the Incas did and the Aztecs did. This was a very highly advanced society with oftentimes hyper-accurate calendars and advanced architecture. One of the first myths that we have to break about the American Indian is this idea of the noble savage who lived closely with nature and took care of the wild. In fact, the Indians were pretty destructive to the wild. They used slash and burn agriculture. One of the strategies they would use would be that they would strip the bark around the trees, allow the trees to die, and drop their dead branches, and then light all of this on fire to clear the land. This provided fertilizer for the land, and it was a great way to clear the land before steel tools. However, it also meant that it left a land that was greatly beaten, greatly depleted. When the first settlers arrived, they did not find a land rich in wilderness. In fact, they found a land largely devoid of trees near the coast, thanks to slash and burn agriculture. North American civilizations were decentralized and environmentally adapted. They tended to stretch from the Ohio Valley to the Atlantic Ocean and south all the way to the Chesapeake Bay of modern Virginia and Maryland. The homes they lived in were oftentimes wigwams made of bent reeds. They were common among the Northeast Woodlands tribes. These homes were easy to build. They used very abundant resources, and they were easy to move with this nomadic lifestyle that many of these Northeast Woodland tribes had. The more advanced societies, such as the Iroquois, lived in longhouse villages. These longhouse villages were common. They tended to live in extended families, with the oldest male being the patriarch of the family. And this would be a large extended family house. Again, the Iroquois Confederacy they tended to be farmers, small game hunters, and fishermen. These were not what we would think of as the wild. This is not Tonto from the Lone Ranger. This is something quite a bit more advanced than that. So it's interesting when you see this. The Iroquois Confederacy was by far the most advanced civilization of the North American tribes. They even had a written constitution, a newspaper, and a written alphabet. It's even rumored that our founding fathers had a copy of the Iroquois Constitution when they wrote our Constitution, and it helped inspire it. The tribes we call the five civilized tribes, the Choctaws, Seminoles, Chickasaws, Creeks, and Cherokee Indians, were the descendants of the Mound Builders. These were the Indians that were the most respected by the European settlers because They were early adopters of what Europeans considered to be civilized things. They were early adopters of Western culture, Western language, and the most civilized thing that they could imagine, slavery. Many of these civilized tribes even owned African slaves and sometimes other Indian slaves. The most famous of the mounds of the Mound Builders is at Cahokia, located near the Ohio River. What you're seeing above here in this slide is an aerial view of Cahokia, and you can see it's laid out like a snake. Something that still amazes people today is that they were able to do this at ground level. It's a great architectural accomplishment. When we leave the 5 civilized tribes and move into the southwestern United States, we find the Pueblo Indians. The Pueblo Indians lived in these apartment-style buildings made of adobe or mud bricks and oftentimes carved out of the cliffs. These were Indians such as the Hopi and Zuni Indians. They lived in planned communities and oftentimes had these kivas designed. Kivas were these large rooms that the Puebloans used for both religious and political meetings. Let's go to our snapshot day, 1492. We know that's when Columbus showed up, but what was life like for the average Indian? We know that there was strict social regimentation among the Indians. Whatever class you were born in, you were likely to stay in, period. We also know that in 1492, cultural diffusion was happening. Cultural diffusion is the spread of culture from one area to another. And we know this from the artifacts left behind by so many of these Indians. There was a great deal of trade and exchange among the Indian tribes. With that, we'll leave the red culture behind and move into the white culture and see how this small place in Western Europe is going to change the history of North America. First European to come to North America was probably Leif Erikson. Leif Erikson was a Viking. He was the son of Eric the Red, the man who discovered Greenland and Iceland. He ends up settling, temporarily at least, on the coast of North America in a place he called Vinland. We've found all kinds of evidence of this Viking settlement now in an area that's today in Canada, in the part of Canada known as Newfoundland. It's not as well known because the Vikings chose not to stay. They made a visit, they probably ran into Indians, and they quickly left. Spain was colonized by first the Greeks, then the Romans, and ultimately conquered by the Visigoths. The Greeks colonized the Iberian Peninsula and gave it its name, Hispania. From Rome, they got the series of laws and much of their language. The Spanish language is a Romance language. And from the Visigoths, these German barbarians, they got some of the most glorious architecture you'll ever see. This architecture that we call Gothic, such as the Gothic Cathedral located in Barcelona, Spain, with their spires reaching to the heavens. Beginning about the year 711 of the Common Era, North African Muslims called Moors invaded into Spain, and they brought with them Spanish architecture and Spanish customs. Customs such as the spoils of war. They will continue to control all or part of Spain from 711 all the way up until approximately 1492. Isabel and Ferdinand united the Iberian Peninsula into the Kingdom of Spain and began the permanent attempt to reconquer the peninsula from the Moors. We call this time period the Reconquista. Prince Henry was a minor prince in Portugal who founded the first navigation school. He brought the greatest cartographers, those are map makers, shipbuilders, and sailors, to teach his sailors how to do this. This is the predecessor to our modern naval academy. Some of the technologies developed by Prince Henry and the Portuguese were the caravel, this small, quick ship used by the Spanish and Portuguese in the 15th and 17th century. It allowed sailors to sail further away and aided the age of exploration. The astrolabe was also something that was absolutely essential to long-distance exploration. The astrolabe was a tool that allowed sailors to get further away from the coastline because for the first time ever, they could determine their latitude prior to the development of the sextant. Another important invention was the mariner's compass. While compasses had been around for a long, long time, the mariner's compass is something different. The mariner's compass allowed sailors to tell direction at sea, something that a traditional compass was incapable of doing. It's at this point in our story that we come across this familiar character, Christopher Columbus. Now you'll notice on this slide it says 1492, Columbus's discovery voyage, with a question mark. Why a question mark? Well, it's because many historians today question whether we should even use the term discovery for Columbus. How does one discover a land where a few million people already live? And what do we really know about this guy, Christopher Columbus? To be honest, very little. Columbus was Italian, although some have speculated that he could have been descended from Spanish Jews that had been removed from Spain during the Reconquista and the forced removal of Jews by Ferdinand and Isabel. Ferdinand and Isabel had come to power and united their kingdoms way back in 1492, about the time the Reconquista ended. At this point, Columbus shows up. Now, Spain wasn't the first place he tried. He had tried all the kingdoms of Europe. But when he finally shows up at the kingdom of Ferdinand and Isabel, he's a desperate man. And he tells his story of the need to sail west to reach the East Indies. He's trying to find these islands just off of India. Well, Ferdinand kind of laughs him off. Ferdinand is not willing to finance this voyage. But Isabel, being smarter than her husband, agrees to pay for the voyage. And she gives Columbus 3 ships. She gives him the now famous Nina, Pinta, and Santa Maria. Now, these are very small ships. The Nina, the Pinta, and the Santa Maria are not large ships. And how did he get his crew? Well, it was largely people dumped from prison. I want you to think about how smart of a decision this was on Isabel's part. She pays for the voyage. If Columbus finds an ocean route to India or to the Indies Islands, Isabel controls that route. If he discovers a new land, Isabel owns it. And if he doesn't, she's out 3 ships that weren't in great condition, and she's emptied out her prisons. This was a brilliant decision on Isabel's part. Columbus's voyage was hazardous. He greatly underestimated the size of the earth. He knew the earth was round, all educated people did, but he didn't know there was this vast continent in the middle of it. So when he lands in what's today the continental plate of America, he doesn't land in the United States, but he believes he's on a series of islands off of India. He names those people Indians and signals the beginning of European conquest of America. So, while it's very hard to say that Columbus's voyage was the discovery voyage, he wasn't even the first European to get here. We know Leif Erikson was here beforehand. The Chinese could have been here, and there was a few million Indians that were already here. Why is he important? Well, when the Europeans showed up with Columbus, they never left. At this point, we're going to move into Christian Europe. In the Age of Discovery, Christianity was the dominant social and political influence throughout Europe. Everybody was part of Christendom, and the Roman Catholic Church was the dominant form of that Christianity. Let's talk about one of these key individuals that came to power under this system, a young German monk named Martin Luther. Now, Martin Luther started his life off not as a monk. He was one of those kids that was always the best and the brightest in his class, the guy that always excelled. And he went off to law school, just as his father wanted, where he studied, and he excelled at law school. He ends up being the number 1 law student in his class. but he absolutely hated every minute of it. You may know people like this, or you yourself may have had one of those things that you were really good at but didn't enjoy. That was Martin Luther. Martin Luther was coming home from college one day, taking this long trek home, and we know this from his own writings. And Martin Luther talks about how he was coming home in this torrential rain. The rains were coming down, and I have this image in my mind of this young German college student walking through the streets with the water running up to his knees and mud everywhere, lightning striking. This is the image that he describes. And he says that he feared for his life when lightning struck a tree near him. This tree falls down, he drops down on his knees right there in the mud, and young Martin Luther yells out to his patron saint. He yells out, "Saint Anne, if you will only defend me, if you'll only save me, I'll dedicate my life to Christ." And the rain stopped. I want you to think about that for a minute. In a time period when we didn't really understand weather and science and the aspects of this, he made a promise that if you'll just stop the rain, I'll dedicate my life to Christ. And the rain stopped. Now that would freak me out. I don't know about you guys, but that's something that would really, really have affected me. So he has to go back and he has to have that discussion with his father, and I imagine it didn't go very well. He tells his father, "Listen, I'm gonna give up law school, and instead I'm gonna become a young, poor monk. I'm gonna go live in a monastery and have a vow of poverty." I can imagine that didn't go over very well, but that's exactly what Martin Luther does. He stops being this law student and instead goes on to become a monk. It's at this point that Martin Luther begins dealing with those questions that we all struggle with at some point in our life. He has a crisis of faith. Have you ever asked yourself that question, how do I know I'm saved? Well, that's the question Martin Luther dealt with. And he goes to the abbot of his monastery, the person that was most responsible for teaching him, and he says, "I've got these questions. I'm dealing with my faith. I've done everything I'm supposed to do. I've done all the ceremonies. I've had the last, or done the Last Supper. I've had baptism. All of the things that are required. I do confession, but I still feel unclean. I still wonder, am I truly saved? What do I do?" And the abbot tells him, "Go read your Bible." Well, that's something that wasn't easy to do in this time. We're talking about 15, 17, 18, 19, right in this area. And most churches had one Bible, and it was this giant tome of a book that sat in the front of the church, and you didn't read them. In fact, if you had a copy of the Bible, it was because you got it through lectura. What I'm doing to you right now, a lecture, is actually an old Latin term, and to lecture meant to read to you. And what would happen is the university professors would read the Bible, and then you would hand copy it down as best you can. Well, Martin Luther didn't have one of those yet, so he goes and he gets this giant tome, and he locks himself up in his cell that he lived in, and he reads this Bible from cover to cover in a few days, like the overachiever that he is. And he finds that he has more questions than he has answers. Martin Luther doesn't find solace in this immediately. In fact, he comes up with the idea of sola scriptura, the idea that scriptures alone are the faith. Scriptures alone are the authority of the church. And he starts seeing other things, and he has other questions. If the Catholic Church is wrong about sola scriptura, because they didn't recognize the Bible as the sole authority, they recognized the Pope as an authority, what else are they wrong about? So he started writing down all these problems he had with the church, and he came up with a list of 95 grievances. This is what's gone down in history as the 95 Theses. Now, Martin Luther, to me, is heroic at this point, because he doesn't just write them down. He writes them down, and he goes and nails them to the front door of the church in Wittenberg. Now, this wasn't uncommon. The church was where bulls were put. That's why it was sometimes called a bulletin board. It's where we get our term from. So when he nails this is where people can read it. And people read it, and they were moved by Martin Luther's statements. And it might have stopped there, except about this same time period, a guy named Johann Gutenberg had invented the printing press. And he took these ideas of Martin Luther and he made copies. And within a fortnight, copies of Martin Luther's 95 Theses had spread throughout Europe. Now, you can imagine this is not going to be something that the Pope is going to be happy with, or bishops are going to be happy with. In fact, one of the bishops famously says, "Bring me the head of that damned German monk." And when he says damned here, he's not using profanity. He's saying that monk that is damned to hell because of what he said, because he's questioned the church's authority. One of those things that he questioned was the church's right to sell indulgences. Now, these are something that the Catholic Church no longer accepts. But once upon a time, the Catholic Church accepted the idea that you could buy an indulgence for your sin. And this was like buying a get-out-of-hell-free card. You could purchase your way out of hell or out of purgatory and into heaven. You could even purchase an indulgence for your dead drunk uncle that misbehaved himself for too long. You're pretty sure your uncle isn't in heaven, but you can get him there if you pay enough money. Well, Martin Luther said that this was ridiculous, that it was anti-biblical, and he attacked it. So he's called forth by this bishop to come forth, and he shows up. Like the good Catholic he is, he still just wants to reform the church. That's why we call it the Reformation. He doesn't want to break with the church. And he's told, you're going to get called up here, and all of your works are going to be here at this table. And you're going to look at those works, and you're going to get asked one question. Are these your works? You're going to say, they are mine. They're going to ask you, do you still mean these words? And you're going to speak one word. You're going to say, recant. You recant those words, or recanto. What that means is, I take it back. And if you just say that, everything will be forgiven. Well, Martin Luther thought about it. He goes up in his cell and he thinks about it. He writes in his diary that he wrestled with the devil all night long about this. And what he means by that is, I wrestled with the decision, should I recant? And ultimately he chooses not to. He steps forward, he's asked that question, are these your words? And Martin Luther says, they are mine. And he said, do you still mean these? And Martin Luther says, here I stand, they are my words, I can do no other. What does he mean by that? Yes, I said them, yes, I mean them. And with this, the authority of the Catholic Church was broken, and Protestantism is born. So, if you're a Lutheran, Baptist, Methodist, Presbyterian, you can trace your lineage back to Martin Luther, a hero of the Protestant Reformation. The next of the Protestant reformers I want to talk about is John Calvin. John Calvin lived from 1509 to 1564. Calvin was a believer in the doctrine of the elect, or what we often call the doctrine of predestination. The way to remember this is through the 5 points of Calvinism. TULIP, total depravity, unconditional election, limited atonement, irresistible grace, and the perseverance of the saints. So what this means is John Calvin would have believed that only the elect go to heaven. And that before you're ever born, God already knows who is going to heaven and who is going to hell. And your works here on earth don't matter. Now, why is that important? Well, there's 2 reasons. One, the Protestants that came to America were Puritans for the most part. And the Puritans and the Pilgrim Separatists as well were both outgrowths of Calvin's version of Protestantism. And the second reason is that it leads to a kind of I don't know, a sense of hopelessness for some people, because if your works don't matter, why behave while you're here? The biggest change in England was with King Henry VIII. Now, Henry VIII is an interesting character because he was never supposed to be King of England. Henry was the second son. His brother was supposed to be King of England. In fact, his brother ended up being given the perfect bride, Catherine, a descendant of the King and Queen of Spain, relative of the King and Queen of France, relation to the Holy Roman Emperor, the perfect bride. However, Henry's brother dies, and Henry has to step up and become this new king. Henry begins as the most Catholic of kings. In fact, he wrote great tracts defending the Pope and was given the title Defender of the Faith by the Pope. But as time goes on, Henry's going to have a break with the church. And it's going to be over a very non-theological matter. In fact, Henry VIII's wife got pregnant very quickly, and he was expecting a son. But instead of a son, a daughter is born. This will go up to be his daughter Mary. The Princess Mary is born. He's a little disappointed with this. Henry needs a son to carry on his name, to carry on the throne. Women had never inherited the throne before. So they try again, and she has a series of stillbirths. It's just not good. Ultimately, Henry falls in love with another woman, a handmaid to his wife, Catherine, and requests a divorce. Decides he wants to divorce her. Says that the reason why is because God is punishing him, because it turns out that Catherine had been the widow of his brother. He'd gotten a papal dispensation to marry her to begin with. Well, the Pope refuses to grant this divorce on a couple of grounds. One, he'd have to admit that the papal dispensation was wrong, which would admit papal fallacy. And two, had he done so, it would have embarrassed the Holy Roman Emperor, who at the time was providing defense for the Vatican City. So he refuses. Henry VIII decides to break with the church. He creates a new church called the Church of England, with himself as the leader of the church. Now he has to ask the leader of the church for permission to get a divorce. He asks himself, he grants it, goes on and has other children, as we know about. In fact, he continues to do this several times. Henry collected wives, divorced, beheaded, died, divorced, beheaded, survived. The next big change is to Henry VIII's daughter, Queen Mary, Mary the First, or Bloody Mary, as we know her. Henry dies. His son becomes king very briefly. His son was very sickly and dies. Mary is really the next big one. Now, Mary is the child of his first wife. She was actually raised in the Spanish court, and she was raised Catholic. So when she comes to the throne, she ends up marrying King Philip of Spain, the Catholic King of Spain, and returns English to Catholicism, continuing the instability of England. She's called Bloody Mary, by the way, because of her tendency to do things like, I don't know, use Protestants as tiki torches. Upon the death of Mary I, her half-sister, Princess Elizabeth, became Queen Elizabeth I, the longest-serving monarch in the history of England until the current Elizabeth. Elizabeth I was a strange choice to take Mary's place. She was the daughter of the lady that replaced Mary's mother. She was raised Protestant and had in fact been imprisoned in the Tower of London as a criminal by Mary. Well, she is now Queen of England. She stabilizes the country, returns it to Protestantism, and it's only with Elizabeth's return that England is stable enough to join in the Age of Discovery. The Prince of the Humanists was a guy named Erasmus of Rotterdam. He was probably the crowning glory of the Northern Renaissance. And while other reformers of the church sought to break with it, guys like Martin Luther and John Calvin, Erasmus stayed a loyal Catholic his whole life, believing in free will, but supporting something called the Via Media, or the middle way, which was a movement to reform the Catholic Church from the inside rather than breaking the church. The first group of Europeans to come to North America and stay were the conquistadors. The conquistadors were literally Spanish conquerors. They were explorers that came to America in search of the three G's: God, gold, and glory. What do we mean by that? Well, they wanted to come to spread the good word of Catholicism. They wanted to get rich off of the gold, silver, and other precious metals of the New World, and ultimately, they wanted the glory of conquest. The first great explorer, or conquistador, if you will, was a Portuguese man named Ferdinand Magellan. Ferdinand Magellan is credited with starting the exploration in 1519 by doing a circumnavigation of the world. Circumnavigation literally means to sail around the world. While Columbus is credited as proving the earth is round, many historians say in fact the person that proved it was Magellan with his circumnavigation. Interestingly enough, Magellan himself did not make it around. He died in a rebellion in the Philippines, and his circumnavigation was completed in 1522 by Juan Sebastian Elcano, one of his men. The next important explorer I want to talk about is Vasco Núñez de Balboa. Balboa was a Spanish explorer, a governor, and of course a conquistador who arrived in the New World around the year 1500. He's credited with discovering and crossing the Central American Isthmus in what's today Panama. He's the first person to see the Pacific Ocean, and he names it the South Sea. Now, a lot of people look at this and they go, why would you call it the South Sea? It's clearly to the west of the Americas. But right there, if you look at this map, where he crossed the Central American Isthmus is the one place in North America where the Pacific Ocean is south of the continent. It later on became known as the Pacific Ocean for its calmness. Don Juan Ponce de Leon was a gentleman from Spain, a member of the noble family, who accompanied Christopher Columbus as a gentleman advisor or a gentleman volunteer on his 1493 second expedition. He ends up settling on the island of Hispaniola, where he helped put down a rebellion of the Taino people, became quite a famous warrior, and set off on a voyage of exploration of his own in 1513. This voyage of exploration landed him on Florida, where he was searching for this mythical fountain of youth. It was a fountain that people believed that if you drank from it, you would eventually attain eternal youth. Well, he never found this fountain of youth that he was looking for. But what he did find was a claim on North America. It's Ponce de Leon's explorations of Florida that gave the Spanish a claim on what would eventually become the United States. He was also instrumental in exploring and eventually conquering the island of Puerto Rico. In 1519, Spain turned her attention away from the Caribbean and towards the Aztec Empire. The Aztec Empire was a massive empire, comparable with the Roman Empire. It was vast. It recognized their king as not just man, but God. Something that shouldn't be seen as unusual. Something that was, in fact, very common even in parts of Europe for a long time. The thought of a divine right king. Probably the most important conquistador of the Age of Discovery period is Hernan Cortes. Perhaps when you were in school you heard him called Fernando Cortes or Ferdinand Cortes. We've kind of stopped doing that now. We give him his Spanish name, Hernan. Hernan was the son of a minor Spanish nobleman who ends up coming to Cuba, rises through the political ranks there in Cuba, ultimately becoming trusted by Diego Velázquez, the governor of Spanish Cuba. Velázquez sends him to Mexico in 1518. When Cortes arrives in Mexico, there's a little bit of question as to what actually happens. He ends up burning all but one of his ships. The one ship that is not burned, he sends back to the king with a note saying that the wood was rotting. It had worm rot in it. Others said that he wanted to keep his soldiers from fleeing from Mexico and the Aztec Indians to go back to Cuba, and by burning the ships, he was able to prevent that from happening. I suppose we'll never know which one is true. So how did Hernan Cortes conquer this seemingly unconquerable Aztec army? Well, he was actually welcomed in by their king Moctezuma and treated like royalty, or maybe even like a visiting god. At this point, Hernan Cortes captured the Aztec king Moctezuma and held him for hostage, held him for ransom, essentially. He tells the Aztecs that he will kill their king if they don't fill a room with gold. Now, I don't know how big this room was, but according to legend, they were able to pay for the voyage over 100 times over. That still leaves us with the essential question of how did this smaller Spanish army, even one led by someone as great as Hernan Cortes, defeat this greater Spanish empire? Well, there's a great book by Jared Diamond called Guns, Germs, and Steel, where he argued that what allowed the Europeans to conquer really all of the world were these three things: guns, germs, and steel. And the greatest of these, in the case of the Spanish at least, was germs. Now, instinctively, we would think that guns were the more important, but let's understand that the guns that we are talking about here are very primitive guns. They're inaccurate. But they're really weapons of terror. They're something that makes a lot of noise and terrifies people. But the guns are not going to be the essential part. Much more important were European-style diseases such as smallpox. The Indians had no immunity to this disease because they hadn't spent generations living with domesticated animals and trading these diseases back and forth as the Europeans had. The Europeans were able to carry these diseases fairly safely, while the Indians were decimated by it. More than decimated. Decimated means 10%. We are talking about a situation where whole swaths of the society were destroyed. You're looking at this picture here. This is an actual picture of what smallpox can still do today. Now imagine what it would have done to a primitive society. The third ingredient in our magic recipe for success here is steel. And steel weapons are something that is a great advantage whenever you're going up against a Stone Age society like the Aztecs were. Imagine if you're armed with a club, but your enemy is armed with swords, bayonets, all kinds of steel weapons. The advantage that the Spanish had was tremendous. Francisco Pizarro is our next important conquistador. While Pizarro cut his conquistador teeth with Balboa in the expedition that discovered the Isthmus of Panama, what he's most famous for is the conquering of the Incan Empire. Now, the Incan Empire was a massive empire in the area that's today Peru. Just as Cortes used the system of capturing a leader, so did Pizarro. Pizarro captured the Incan emperor Atalupa and held him hostage until a room was filled with gold, promising to release Atalupa afterwards. Pizarro did not keep his promise. He ended up putting on trial Atalupa for crimes against the crown, finding him guilty, and sentencing him to death. But what's most important about this is it gave the Spanish a claim on South America. Alvar Núñez Cabeza de Vaca. head of cow if you've had your Spanish classes. Cabeza de Vaca was one of the few survivors of the fated 1527 Narvaez expedition. Everyone else dies except for Cabeza de Vaca and a Moorish sailor named Esteban or Estevanico. Estevanico and Cabeza de Vaca survived for 8 years in what's today Texas and New Mexico, Arizona, in that region, as faith healers, as kind of shamans. They understood a little bit more about germ theory than, say, the Indians did. When Cabeza de Vaca does finally return to Spanish-held territory in what's today Mexico, he tells stories that he heard of fabulous cities of gold. Now, it should be noted that Cabeza de Vaca himself never claimed to have seen these cities of gold. He just heard the stories of it. And that's going to fuel future Spanish expeditions in the area that will become Texas. These legendary cities of gold have come down to us as the legend of El Dorado. But at the time period, these cities were called Cibola, Cibola. And today we know that these cities of gold were, at the very least, overstated. Francisco Vasquez de Coronado, or just Coronado for our purposes, was the man tasked with discovering these cities of gold. He hoped to find Cibola, and he led a path through northern Mexico all the way up into modern-day Kansas, searching for these cities. Between 1540 and 1542, he makes the single largest expedition through North America in all of history. It was a massive cattle drive. In fact, some early Texas historians believed that the early Texas livestock, the longhorn, are descendants from the remnants of the cattle that Coronado brought along with him on this drive. Well, time and again he fails to find these cities, but he does find pueblos. And ultimately it's determined that the city of gold was nothing more than a mud brick building. And many times students have a hard time understanding why these would be mistaken for cities of gold. But if you've ever taken a drive out to Colorado or Utah and seen adobe villages in the sunlight, you can quickly understand why they would call these golden cities. The lack of a city of gold and the lack of gold in America is going to cause the Spanish to basically ignore Texas for the next 50 years. The last section of Gary Nash's Red, White, and Black that we're going to look at is the Black Society, the African Society. Admittedly, this is going to be the section with the least amount of information. Not so much because they weren't as important to history, but because, unfortunately, history is written by the winners. And it was the Western Europeans that won the colonial wars. So we just don't have as much written information about the Black Society. One of the reasons we don't know as much about the African Society is the African diaspora. A diaspora is the forced removal of a people from their homeland. And this happens roughly in the 16th, 17th, and slightly into the 18th century, 16th and 17th century for the most part. Somewhere around 140 million Africans were moved from the coast of Africa and settled mostly in the Americas. About 46 million of those in what ends up becoming the United States. West African culture was a unique culture. It didn't have a lot of large cities, although there were some, such as Timbuktu. It was mostly small villages. They tended to be patriarchal, which is male-dominated, and tended to be people living in small houses, small villages, dominated by a single man, but living as an extended family. Now, what that means is you would be living with your grandparents and your cousins and all these people. They would all be together. They also had a very complex religion, something quite a bit different than we've seen in other parts of the world because of their unique geography. Think about where Africa is. It's right there between the Middle East, and you cross the Silk Road over there. You come through Africa. You can cross over the Strait of Gibraltar and hit Europe. And it's this area where the native African animistic beliefs, that's the belief that spirit inhabits everything, the Jewish beliefs from the Middle East, the Islamic beliefs that came over from Saudi Arabia, and even the Christian beliefs that came from both the Middle East and across from Spain, they all mixed together and created this very cosmopolitan religion that was easily understandable. It made it very easy for the Africans to adopt other religions. They did practice division of labor. That means they did have jobs, and they did have slavery. But what's interesting about their slavery is while it was practiced, it was not generational. It's going to take the Europeans to add that particular heinous aspect to it. If you were a slave, it was because you were either in debt to someone and couldn't pay your debt back, or you were a prisoner of war. So it's something quite a bit different. Now, that kind of slavery is still around today, unfortunately, in parts of Africa. But it is largely died out. Slavery probably would have remained along the African model, except for the growing importance of sugar in Europe, particularly in England, made the importance of slaves increase dramatically, and the demand for African slaves went up. And suddenly, Europeans began redefining the African from being the noble savage, I guess is the term you would use, a very noble person that they had a great deal of respect to being less than human. And they began this generational, race-based type of slavery. The mixing of all this led to the destruction of traditional cultures. The rich got richer, the poor got poorer. Africa was burdened with famine after famine after famine, as the best and brightest were stolen in the diaspora, and Europe carved up Africa, leaving a country or a continent that really should be among the richest in the world if you look at its natural resources, as being among the poorest. I guess in culmination, the Age of Discovery period is, as Gary Nash said, a collision of cultures. The red culture, the American Indian, the white culture, the Western Europeans, and the black culture, the Africans.